Okay, everyone. So good morning, evening, afternoon, depending on where you're joining from around the world. My name is Drew Stark. I am the VP for North America for Ataccama. We are definitely happy to have you all here today to discuss the state, the current state and evolution of data governance. That will be the kind of topic for today's discussion. We are joined by two very well-versed speakers to help us lead this discussion. We have Achim Granzen, the principal analyst at Forrester and the author of the latest Forrester Wave for Data Governance Solutions. And then we also have David Kolinek, who is the VP of Product Management at Ataccama as well. Achim will be giving an overview of his findings from his most recent research on the state of data governance and the evolution to go with that, what this means for the future of data governance, and how organizations can mature their capabilities to better leverage their organization's enterprise data assets, which is a very familiar topic among all of us who are here today. David will then join Achim in a live discussion to provide insight on techniques and examples you can use to help you embrace the future of data governance and to also help improve your organization's data management and governance strategies as a whole. We will have some time to answer questions today, so please feel free to use the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen for any Q&A. Feel free to submit your questions, and at the end, we will address those with both of the gentlemen here today. Without further ado, I will hand things over to Achim to begin by taking you through the current state of data governance. Achim,
well, thanks much, Drew, and warm welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody who's been joining the call. Excited to be here. Thanks much, Ataccama, for having me. Maybe a few words about Forrester Research. We are an advisory and research firm operating globally, focusing on technologies, customer experiences, and B2B technologies. So my focus is on emerging technologies. And that's also the angle that I'm taking now to talk a bit about the state of data governance and how the scope of data governance, how the capabilities required to do data governance successfully have actually changed and have expanded. So that's really, in a nutshell, what I'm going to talk about is how can you expand your capabilities on data governance to meet with the requirements, with the changed and expanded requirements that are coming onto the topic of data governance, onto the discipline, and how can you actually start and make that a team sport, because that's really going to be the main conclusion, that data governance must become a team sport involving multiple different disciplines. So over the next 20 minutes or so, there's a couple of talking points that I wanted to cover. The first one is really to double click on this evolution of data governance. A lot of that has been driven by the expanded prevalence and use of artificial intelligence for decision making. AI needs data, so data for AI is one of the data needs for AI are one of the major drivers in the evolution of data governance. And we want to understand a bit are organizations actually prepared for that. Then we're going to look at what data governance must do. That's the double clicking on the details. Data governance must step up, and organizations must adapt their strategy and their technologies to cope with these new requirements that expanded scope. I'm going to finish off with a summary of recommendations, how you can actually mature your capabilities, looking around compliance, literacy, and quality as 3 focus points within the scope of data governance. But let's get going with the first one. And I just want to talk a bit about how I see, or how we see at Forrester see, that AI is indeed expanding the scope of data, but also of technology governance in general. So if you look at the state of discussion that we're currently having within AI about algorithms, it probably boils down to something like this, right? So are AI algorithms actually, are they good or evil? Can they ever be trusted with our data? That's a lot of top of mind question that we have, not just in expert discussions, but also in public discussions. Right? We're seeing this discussion crucially expanding into the general public at the moment, which is another key driver for organizations, because that will be their customers, that will be their prospects, those will be their employees. So we have a number of different groups of participants that are actually coming with questions like this in mind. it's probably a too superficial question, so it doesn't really go deep enough. And especially with if you look at how does it apply to organizations, how does questions like this apply to what we're doing in governance, we probably need to drill a little bit deeper about that. So let's look at two aspects of this. One is the consumer perspective, and one is the legislatory perspective. So if you look at it from the consumer perspective, I think we're looking at data for that's being used for hyper personalization and other insights-driven business decision making, and they have an insatiable appetite for data. So, but what use of data, to what extent is actually acceptable to consumers, right? If consumers find out that the data is being compromised, that the data is being used unethical, or that the data is being used outside the boundaries of data protection laws and legislations, will they actually start voting with their wallets if the data is compromised? So the key driver from the consumer perspective, or from our customer perspective to our organizations, is what happens if data governance goes wrong? Will this impact how our consumers are actually looking at it, how consumers are trusting us? And this is a clear indication that we see in the market over the last couple of years. Consumers become a lot more conscious, similar to what we had, say, 10 years ago with environmental questions, or with questions of safe workplaces, ethical conditions of work. We see the same consumer consciousness now coming up on a data level. So that's definitely something that is to be considered, because that will impact not just our business, but also our brand perception if there is any breach of data, any compromise, anything that we've done wrong, or that has happened within the scope of data governance. Now, the other question, the other angle is, will governance actually enforce legislation on data and AI, like they did with environmental laws, like they did with work on environment laws? So we're currently at a turning point here, where we really see the first initiatives around algorithm legislation taking shape. That happens in the EU, but also in places like China. So we have another driver from the government, from the legislation side, that actually triggers organizations to start seriously looking into how do they govern, how do they manage their data when it comes to their data use by AI, using AI algorithms for decision making. So that's the two major drivers that I see from the consumer perspective, and also from the legislation, from the government perspective. But are organizations actually prepared for that? And this is, I think, the key question that we are asking in our discussions with clients. One thing that we do at Forrester is we field large-scale global surveys every year to understand the priorities and challenges of technology and business decision makers. We call these technographics. And some of these questions that we're asking them is essentially around the state of data governance. How are organizations currently looking into data governance? And we can deduct some interesting insights from that to see, from our perspective, are they prepared for that changing scope? So let's look at some of these insights that we got on how organizations take on data governance. The first one, well, that's a good one. Data governance is one of the top 5 priorities that organizations actually have when it comes to overall plans and initiatives for data management. So, and note that there's a difference really. We have data quality, master data management, data security on this list too. All of these are actually foundations for data governance, but that's the technical part, right? These are not data governance. They just give us the technology, the technology foundation to execute on data governance. So it's really important to see that data governance and auditing is really a separate topic. We have technology enablers, but then we have to actually make it work on top of that platform. So that's a good point. It is a priority. So, but are organizations actually, how are they faring when it comes to executing on data governance? And that's where we see a pretty interesting picture, because there's quite a few very distinct challenges. That's to essentially across the globe for most global organizations. We see very common trends, we see very common challenges. And probably the top three here are not surprising. Maturity of the technology, lack of technical skills, maturity of data management technologies. These are issues that we're having everywhere where we are deploying the latest technologies. Organizations take some time to catch up with them. But what's really interesting here is that the execution and realization of governance actually faces organizational business issues, right? Lack of budget, organizational issues with data stewardship and data governance, which really relates all about how are we organizing our data governance, how we are executing data governance. And that's really where we transition from a technology and solutions discussion to a larger picture about creating and realizing a data governance strategy within the organizations. And that's where things like budgeting and organizational issues to actually anchoring that strategy come into place. So how do organizations actually realize their data governance initiatives at the moment? That's another interesting pictures where we see that really most organizations are really at the, well, we would call that beginner stage of realizing the data governance. So they're at the beginner stage of a low to intermediate maturity. You can really see that is strategies around data governance are remaining to be incomplete. It's only a quarter of the respondents that we had in this survey actually have something that we call a well-defined and documented data governance programs in place. Only one quarter, around about 27% have a clearly defined program in place. That means all the other 73% doing it more in an ad hoc manner. Same, only 27% involve data and business teams in the data governance workstream. Again, what do the other 73% do? They will treat this isolated. They will treat this maybe in compliance. They may will treat this within the technology and IT functions. So data governance really remains siloed. And lastly, what's really daring here is that the same percentage, just over a quarter, actually have an executive leader in charge of data governance. And that's a crucial shortfall in my perspective, because that means data governance is siloed. It does not have executive support. It's not at a level within organizations where it actually has to be. So how can we change that? How can data governance actually step up? It's good, it's a priority, but we see that organizations really have challenges and are still at a rather low maturity stage. So I think that organizations must adapt their strategy and their technology when it comes to data governance. So let's take a look at what data governance actually has gone through over the past number of years. So we started from a technology focus, that's around master data, quality, cataloging, etc. That's still important. That's the foundations, as I said earlier. We added then data privacy, data protection, data sovereignty over time. This was, and it still is, a major impetus for organizations to actually start taking their data governance strategy seriously, start implementing a strategy that goes beyond just the technology. But this also gave way to the rise of new data governance capabilities that we see, because now we need to really expand from the more technical focus to something that involves compliance teams, data protection. We need to focus a lot more, become a lot more serious, to become our policies. But now we have additional topics to focus on. We have seen compliance and risk. There's a massive increase in that demand when it comes to how AI leverages data. There's a massively increased risk both on the consumer side and on the regulatory side, because both of them are essentially closing in to drive the uptake of governance and technology risk management. We look into data collaboration because data has become a very the most valuable asset within an organization. So we need to understand, how do we actually drive collaboration? How do we use more data but still stay in the compliance and risk framework that we have been set up? In order to do that, we need to have data literacy. We need to have more and more people enabled within our organization to actually go out and use data for their decision making. And we need to have data democratization, which is if you will, the technology foundation to making data available, to making access to data available to as many people as possible within the organization. So let's take a brief look at democratization, literacy, collaboration, and compliance, because these are really the major areas, the major new areas that we see data governance has to step up to. The first one is data democratization. So this is really what gives everybody a voice. This is an enabler. We had a lot of discussions in the past. Data democratization, that's the end state. No, it's not. It's essentially shifting from data as a team asset to data as a corporate asset, where we are allowing as many people within the organization as possible to actually be able to access data and use data for their decision making. So that just gives lines of business essentially the opportunity to take on more data and more advanced analytics by themselves, doing it within the business units, rather than just leveraging say a technology function or an IT function to do it for them. That's the foundation, really. Data democratization allows everybody to have a voice, but how do people actually make use of that? Now they have the ability to use data. How do they go ahead and use that? And that's where data literacy comes in. This is essentially the people component, the cultural component, the equivalent to data democratization, because this is where we look into the ability to work with data in the context of your business priorities and your outcomes. This is where we step up from just giving people access to data to actually work with them and enable them how to use it. It's really, if you think of like a book, for example, a book is, if you don't know how to read, it's no good at all at having all these books. You can use them as a doorstop. So it's the same with data democratization. Yes, you have the technology, you have to have the access to data, but you have to be able to understand how to use that. That's a training, that's a cultural probe. So the investments that we have in technology on the democratization side, making the data available, we have to complement those investments with investments in skills and culture to actually enable as many people as possible within our organization to use data for their day-to-day business decisions. The third one that I wanted to touch upon is around data collaboration. So, and that's really a logical extension. Now you have teams enabled. You have more and more people enabled within your organization. Now, none of them actually is going to work their best within and just by themselves, just as lone rangers. Now collaboration comes into place, and this is the third step that data governance actually has to take care of. We not just have to put the foundations in place. We not just have to enable people, as many people as possible. We have to also allow them to collaborate, because collaborative insights, it's really what's accelerating this data insights and action cycle, whether it's on customer experiences, employee empowerment, or any other business process. Data literate employees actually form tribes and ad hoc teams in a data-driven culture. So that's where you essentially step up at each of these areas. You step up the game. How important, how well you can actually leverage data within your organization. We have things like external data sharing and external data exchange. That also brings opportunities and threats. So there's another angle to that collaboration, because it can also go beyond the walls or beyond the confinements of your organization. And the last one that I wanted to touch upon is risk and compliance. So this is really something, as I said earlier, this is compliance together with cybersecurity. Actually, these are the guardrails for organizations seeking to up their data and insights game. This is really where we see a distinct change in risk and compliance becoming agents of change, not just inhibitors, not just, say, preventing people to do something, to use data, having a prohibitive function within the organization. Risk and compliance teams have to become an agents of change, because they need to actively go out and essentially communicate what's possible. what's available, what's within the accountability frameworks that an organization has. And that's really another building block in that expanded scope of data governance, to enable organization to manage data and processes for compliance needs as well, and essentially balance that with the data needs and the data appetites that we've seen. So you can see these 4 steps, essentially that fourth one is kind of balancing out the other 3 in a way, that we enable as many people in organizations as possible to look into data and be able to use it. But then we have to ensure that guardrails are in place, and data governance functions, the data governance discipline has to cover both of that. Let's move ahead a little and look at what are the recommendations that we have. What should you do now to get yourself, your data strategy and your organization ready for this expanding scopes? And here are some of the recommendations that we have from Forrester's perspective. So the first one is really on data technology. Drive data democratization, ensure data quality. That's the foundation. In the data processes, integrate governance processes within business processes, bringing those teams together. Security, privacy, compliance must become a cornerstone. Without that, any data leverage will fall apart. Enterprise cross-divisional data catalogs and policies will actually help that organization-wide leverage of data. We also need to look into, apologies, that's moved too far ahead here. Let me go back to that slide. The last one is data people. That's really the important one, because that often falls back and behind that. We have to build our data literacy programs. We have to instill a data collaboration and sharing culture. So essentially putting all this together, maturing and broaden your governance capabilities, and shift to a data culture that drives purposeful focus on the technologies and the processes and on the human skills. That's the challenge for data governance profession. So how can you get there? The data governance really must become a team effort to combine technology, processes, and people. And there's a bit of a ghost in the machine apparently on the slides. Let me go back to this one. That team effort is really important, because we have an expanded scope for data governance. What we also have is we have a lot of new stakeholders coming in. We have expanded the user community of data. We have expanded who are we working with. We have compliance teams. We may have ethics teams. We have different business units, and all of them have to come together to actually really make data governance a team sport. That's the crucial recommendation here. It can't just be a function that's situated, say, just in IT, just in technology. It can't be a function that is just being executed within the say GDPR compliance part. No, it has to expand. It has to bring together the latest technologies, the process, and the people from across the organization. And that's really the question: how can you achieve that? Obviously, you have to step up your data. You have to formulate your data governance strategy. You have to mature that. But data governance solutions, as such, can help you to mature these capabilities, because they can provide the data foundation for business decision making that allows you to use your data for business decision in a controlled manner. They balance strong technical capabilities with really extensive management capabilities. And that's really, from a data governance solutions perspective, the crucial step that we've seen over the last couple of years. It's becoming increasingly important to look into policy management, enabling collaboration beyond just the technical capabilities of data quality, data cataloging, etc. And they have to ensure security, privacy, and compliance, drive accountability and trust. That's really key, because that trust is very important, because at the end, consumers will be impacted by the business decision that they're making based on data. So we need to understand what effects potential breaches and potential misuse of data has. So data governance has really a far-reaching effort all the way into the relationships that organizations that we have with our customers. To finish off, I just wanted to leave you with the data governance wave. We talked a bit about how data governance solutions can actually support you to mature your data governance strategy. And this is the research that Drew alluded to in the end. We looked at the data governance providers, the 12 ones that mattered most, and how they stack up. What you can see really that Ataccama has a strong position here as a leader. What we said about Ataccama is essentially a top choice for clients looking to incorporate top data quality capabilities into the data governance solutions, particularly where large-scale on-premises and cloud environments are prevalent. It's a key thing, a key find that we found, that clients are really using Ataccama to establish and mature the enterprise data governance framework. And that's, I think, in a nutshell, the value that data governance solution can bring to the table. When you're looking to your mature data governance capabilities, those solutions are a key building block to actually help you execute your strategy. So with that, I'd like to finish off the presentation part. Hope you found this insightful. Please do reach out to connect with me on LinkedIn. Happy to hear from you outside the webinar or after the webinar as well.
Thank you very much, Achim. This is David speaking. Hi, everyone. I really want to thank you for the presentation. I think it was really nicely presented. I made a couple of notes, so we will be now following up with the live discussion. I also want to encourage the people listening to this webinar. If you have any questions, either to Achim or to me, you can send those questions into the Q&A section. So we will go through some of the topics that I prepared now, and then we will also have a Q&A. So send the questions there and we will get to it and address it at the end of this webinar. So what I wrote down is this. I wanted to start with a shout out and actually like thanking you, you personally, but also Forrester, for the definition of the data governance wave. What I really appreciate is the fact that your perspective is kind of broad and you don't focus only on the definitions and defining terms, policies, rules, but you also focus on its application. Because like if you have like the best knowledge base that ever existed, but it's static and it's not really actively used, then the benefit is really limited. So what I really like compared to like, let's say some of the other reports on the market is the fact that you actually increase the scope for the things like data quality, both the validation of the quality and obviously improving the quality. And you are also including things like, for example, master data management, because I completely agree with your point of view. The data governance is definitely not about definitions, only about definitions, but mainly about its applications. So that was just like a quick shout out. There's no question there. And now I wanted to follow up with one thing. Quite often, when we talk about data democratization and data privacy with the customers and data protection, yeah, you can actually see that those two topics are kind of contradictory to each other. So many times we actually hear that customers are a bit afraid if they want to move into the data democratization topic and they want to build a platform that will allow data analysts, for example, to access the data easily. They really worry that the security is going to be affected and some issues might come out of it. So I wanted to quickly comment on this. This might be really relevant for many people listening because like this, let's say, this fear is not really something you have to be limited by because there is fairly easy solution for that. And I would also follow up with a question asking you, like, how do you see the impact of that? So regarding the solution and the experience we gained, what we are actually doing, I think it's important that you have one system that allows you to manage both the data democratization and data privacy, data protection. This means that the element that the people are working with, those being like the data objects, the data assets, are actually the same assets that you are then using while defining some specific policies, regulations, or standards, procedures. Anything you're defining on the policy level has to be actually directly linked with the objects that the data assets, that the data analysts are using. Because with this approach, you can really easily achieve, let's say, a nice balance between the democratization and keeping the security. How it, for example, looks with Ataccama 1, we have a dedicated section where you can actually define policies, but the policy is not only plain text. While defining the policy, you can work with data objects, with business terms. And in the policy definition, you can define some requirement, and you will include, let's say it's a semi-structured format, you will really include also the business term definition directly in the policy definition. So this is one side. And then on the other side, talking about the data democratization, you have a data catalog that has all the data assets. And within the data catalog, the business terms are actually mapped to the data assets. We are automating the classification. And then when a data analyst opens some data asset, they will see that this is, for example, table that contains information about product data. And because the product data is actually an element that's also used in the policy definition, you can really easily apply all the regulations and, let's say, the enforcement that has been defined in the policy on the data object directly. So hopefully the explanation was hopefully it was clear. It would be better if I had some slide to show you with that. But the point really here is, if you have two completely separate solutions, one for data democratization, usually data catalog is used for that, and then you have yet another completely different solution for the data protection, where you just define the policies. Somebody with the experience from legal team and security team defines the policies, but there is no real integration. Then you really have a big issue. But this is not the only way how you can do it. You can actually look out for solutions that do both of these areas in the same solution, and they're actually tightly integrated. And in this particular case, you don't really have to worry about it, because the security is automatically applied even in the data catalog. So just a comment and let's say enforcement for anybody listening, you don't have to worry about the data democratization affecting your security. It's not really an issue that cannot be solved. Achim, what do you think about the importance of data democratization and the impact of data catalog? Is the democratization the biggest driver for companies to implement data catalog solutions? Or what is really the importance of the data catalog within the data governance strategy? Is the democratization the main driver? How do you see it?
Yes, it's David. Thanks. It's a key driver, and I think what's important to see, and also very exciting to see in this space, is how the different components are now coming together into something that we call data governance solutions. So we had data catalogs, we had data quality tools. We talked about mentioned data security tools. So all of them are essentially building blocks on the technology side that help you build the foundation to realize your data governance strategy. But they cannot be separate anymore. They have to be at least integrated. And obviously what we're seeing now is when we move towards the data governance solutions, all of these building blocks are integrated. So you asked about data catalog. So what's the role of a data catalog within that data governance strategy and within these four areas that are outlined earlier? So catalogs really have to deliver data context, profiling, defining, and maintaining semantic, logical, physical models. We have machine learning that actually supercharges the traditional metadata glossary technology. All of that is really important, and that's the foundation to help or to build an enterprise hub across the ecosystem, where we talked about really expanding the audience of people that are actually using data for their decision making. And that's the key role where we see a data catalog being the foundation to executing the data governance strategy. That's a technical foundation, business glossary, data stewardship, data preparation, data marketplace. All of that builds on the catalog that lies underneath and actually enables that. So it's a key enabler. And if you look at about realizing your data governance strategy, what do you actually do on top of that? Well, the key differentiator is so far we just talked about data, right? But data it's not really about the data, it's about the insights that the data can deliver. So that's the business benefit. So that's where you essentially adding up on the data focused catalogs to really bring a governance strategy to life. So you have to look at organizational structures, you have to look at ownership, stewardship, projects that are defining the framework for the operational data governance. And that's really I think the key, the overall objective is to have a strategic data governance that unifies data analytics and governance priorities and demonstrates how these can together drive business. And that's the key thing about the governance strategy, is that you're bringing all of these together. It builds on a strong technical foundation. The data catalog is a key component of that. But then you have to essentially, once you have that in place, you're not done yet. You just have prepared yourself to take off. That's just the runway. Now you essentially need to execute that strategy, as I said, with across all functions regarding data analytics, governance priorities. So it's in that way, the data catalog is the runway, right? Then you're ready for takeoff, but you still have to take off. That's really how I see them. That's what we've seen, say, really over the past couple of years. That's the new, what we call the new scope of data governance, and that's what the cutting edge data governance solutions like Ataccama are actually enabling you to do. It's not that piecemeal approach anymore. It gives you that unifying approach. And I mentioned earlier, like machine learning and AI is actually also a key driver for the use of data, but it's also a key technology that's used within data governance solutions. I mentioned how it supercharges like glossaries, how it actually actively guides people through policy processes, for example. So just wanted to ask you, David, what are your thoughts on the usage of AI, say, both within the concept of leveraging data, but also how you're using it within Ataccama?
Mm-hmm. So I think exactly in the example you just gave, that the data catalog, once you have it, once you launch it, this is not the end, this is actually the beginning, because you have to launch it, you have to spread it out across the whole company, and you really have to populate it with quality information, with the insights. This is exactly when you can leverage the AI quite a lot. If you only connect to the systems and populate the catalog with technical data, it will have very little value only for the technical folks. The business people, they wouldn't be able to actually use it, right? Because once they are looking for data, they are using the business definitions, for example, or they are not really looking for data per se. They might be looking for specific APIs or specific business terms, specific data domains. And this is obviously not there. Like, you don't get this metadata from a database. So how do you get it? Obviously, you can ask the users to populate it manually. That's, let's say, the old approach, which usually doesn't really work because it requires like a huge amount of effort and really discipline, let's say. But like practically, you can never make it up to date after a long period. Like the environments are changing so quickly that you cannot do it just using manual effort. And this is actually where the AI can come in handy. So I can give you some specific examples. What are we doing at Ataccama to leverage it? One of them I already mentioned briefly, and that's the data classification. So as we have the business glossary within the product, you have business terms and they have like specific definitions written in plain text. That's really like plain text description. You have some text, maybe some images, tables, explanations. And it's like purely business term, business definition. There is no technical implementation. There is no specific rule. But what you need to do is to really identify all the places in the catalog where this specific data object is present. What we are doing is we are creating, we call it fingerprint. I don't want to go into the technical details, but basically you can imagine it as a unique identifier for any data attribute you have in the catalog. So if you have a table, the table has 20 columns, we create 20 unique identifiers for those 20 columns. And it's like mathematical representation of this specific attribute. It's basically a vector. What we are then doing is we are identifying the proximity and basically looking for the data attributes that are very close to each other and create clusters. And even without understanding, let's say, the meaning of this specific attribute, we can group all the similar attributes together. And then with some interaction with the end user, we can showcase all the data attributes with the highest proximity. And then some specific data steward is going to be asked in the application, is going to get some like notification to take a look at it. He's going to be notified. And he can say, okay, so all of those 20 attributes that you automatically identified are actually, for example, product code. And then as the data catalog is being populated with additional systems in the future, because this is not a one-time thing, this is like ever-going process, all the other occurrences of the product IDs will be automatically classified and automatically tagged with this specific asset. So for example, the data classification is a perfect use case where you can leverage the machine learning functionality because the classification is really something you need to do on scale, and you really want the business users to be able to do it themselves without defining some regular expressions or coding. So this is one example that we rely on quite a lot. And there is one more, and that's related to the data quality part. Obviously, in many cases, you really want to have some specific data quality rule that's defined by a user. Companies need to, for example, report how they calculate specific metrics. And for that, you really want a rule. But there are so many things happening within the data that you cannot possibly define rules for all the possible occurrences of data quality issues that might occur. And that's just not possible. You can always be only reactive. Once you find some issue, once somebody will report it, then you can define a rule that will make sure this issue that never happens again. And if it happens, you will be notified. But it's only reactive. You're always one step behind. If you want to be proactive, this is actually where you can leverage the machine learning. We are automatically identifying anomalies in the data. And this is purely done based on detection of the patterns and like the differences in the data over time. So there is no specific rule. Basically, the system is detecting the differences in the data. And if there is some anomaly, it's an interaction, right? So it's AI. So you have to be learning, the model have to be learning. There needs to be some feedback mechanism. So once there is some anomaly detected, a data steward is going to get a notification to take a look at it, and they can validate whether this actually is anomaly or not. Let's say maybe you have like some time series prediction. So you have actually expected there's going to be drop in some data coming in because it's Sunday. So you will mark it as a not anomalous value. And then the platform is learning from this user feedback. It's really building, let's say, in the time series and the differences across different dates. So this is yet another amazing use case because I really like this. It's proactive. It's not only reacting to issues and then making sure it never happens again. It happens for the first time, and we are actually able to detect there is something weird happening with the data, take a look at it, and act instantly. So this is another one. I would really encourage people to look for solutions like this, because if you want to scale your company and scale your operation, if you're always one step behind, only reacting to the issues that occurred, and you know about the issue only like a week after it actually occurred, you will never be able to get ahead of your competition. So I would not really take this lightly and focus on it. I think it can make a huge difference for you. So I guess those would be the two biggest ones I would mention.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I see we have a number of questions already coming in.
Let's take a look at it.
Yeah. So there is one that we have essentially, is data quality a prerequisite for data governance, or can they be introduced simultaneously? Just going through from the top of the questions here. So I mean, from what we've seen in this in the little step up graphic that I had earlier on, data governance is a crucial technology. Data quality is a crucial technology capability for data governance. So can you introduce both at the same time? Well, so from my perspective, and that's what we've seen in a lot of organizations in the past, they have a data quality initiative, they have a master data management initiative, they have a data privacy initiative when GDPR came up. So these are all siloed. The better way of doing this is essentially to come up with a data governance strategy and then introduce different crucial components as you go along. So you would have to start with a technical foundation, so whether that's a catalog or data quality. So implement that first. But it's very much recommended to lay out your data governance strategy where data quality in your case might be the first capability that you actually want to implement. So that gives you the big picture, but that also allows you to focus on first things first, which is getting the technology foundation ready. David, any thoughts from your side?
I think you answered it well. I would just maybe add one thing. I would really encourage people to start even with something that might seem small, like it might be too overwhelming to define the strategy when you are looking at a white paper. So if there is some specific issue you need to address, I wouldn't really wait. If it's something urgent, you can obviously approach it. You can figure out a way how to address it. And as you would be doing it, you will get a lot of let's say insights, and you will learn a lot of things that would later on help you define the strategy. So if the question is really meant like this, do I need to have the comprehensive strategy first, and only after that I can start with the data quality? I wouldn't really suggest it, even though it's obviously better to have the strategy, but I think you can do those things in parallel, and the information you will get, the experience will help you build a better strategy for the data governance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely right. Now, I didn't mean to say, okay, just have a massive data governance strategy program in place first before you start. No, that's not. Of course, you have to fix issues when they arise. But keep in mind that's the first step that you're actually doing. You're building the first capability of a larger data governance strategy. So that's I think I'm fully aligned with you, David. There's another question coming here from Yap asking the thoughts on choosing an enterprise data platform with capabilities across MDM, data quality, leaders, etc., or a best of breed solution architecture with best solutions in each of these categories. And that's a very interesting question, because that's exactly where we are seeing where the market is pivoting at the moment. So from my side, I would be very interested to hear your thoughts, David. But what we've seen happening is that historically, yes, it has been an assemblance of best of breed solutions, because we had separate initiatives, as I said before. There was an MDM initiative, there was a data quality initiative. So a certain tool or solution was actually put in place. But with that scope of data governance, the integration becomes a much bigger, much more burning issue than it was before. So how do we actually string together all of these capabilities? That's now the key. That's the key question. That's exactly where you're making the step up from just looking at one of these point solutions into really defining and implementing your data governance strategy, as opposed to, say, an MDM strategy. But David, I guess you have a couple of points on that one.
So again, I will add one. I really like the idea behind the data fabric, and I actually think, if I'm not mistaken, you can correct me, I think you would be also releasing some specific report or maybe even wave for this topic, right? I like the idea behind it, because nowadays the ecosystem is so broad that you just cannot have everything from one vendor. So even if you purchase the one enterprise data platform that does it all, it probably happens that you will find out that you already have something within your company that's being used by some team, and you will have to integrate with it. And then maybe you will find some like single purpose solution for one like tiny use case, but it's actually going to be able to fulfill this use case really well. So it would be a pity not to use it. So even though the enterprise data platforms are good, and basically I'm like shooting myself in the leg now, because this is what we provide, I wouldn't only focus on this and saying you need to have one platform that does it all. The idea behind the data fabric really is that as you have some like common architecture standards, you can actually integrate like even different modules that you have from different vendors using different technologies, but because the common interface, you can leverage it. One thing that's really worth mentioning that nobody really talks about that much, it's the user experience. So the idea, the theory is amazing, but if you really have like 7 different solutions and they have some standardized interface, sure, you can integrate it, but the user is definitely going to notice. So I would also suggest to limit the number of technologies you bring in, because then the users, they will be the one affected by it the most. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Now I think what's another key consideration here is that you will look at how can you best essentially orchestrate all the different let's call them capabilities, because they can be in one solution. They can be seamlessly integrated by, say, a niche solution that just does one thing right. And I think that's really is what we've seen, the shift, and that's why we are now starting to talk about data governance solutions. Solutions that actually put these integration, that cross leverage first, on you mentioned data fabric earlier. That's another of these, say, unifying conceptual ideas that we see a lot happening. So this is really the trend. How can you unify it? Because you would have to, and that's almost goes into the next question. You cannot silo this anymore in terms of data governance becoming a topic at a corporate level. So you have to treat it on a corporate level. You have to be able to look at this as much as possible across your entire organization, and that's where essentially the ideas of governance solutions, data fabrics that actually span across everything really come to play. There's one that I think has a technical component as well. David, I'll probably put that to you. Should a huge company have a single data catalog managed centrally, or is it okay for each business unit region to have their own catalogs? How do you advise clients? We said earlier, Ataccama is really very often being used by clients with large enterprise scale deployments. So you probably have a good perspective on that one.
Mm-hmm. It's not like binary. I would start with that. The best case scenario for me is to actually use one data catalog. There are some exceptions, but if you really have one catalog, and if you think about the purpose, you want to have one place where anyone can find information about all the existing data assets. So if you have multiple data catalogs, for example, multiple like business units, then you're actually breaking this premise and you don't have one place anymore. You have dedicated places for dedicated teams. If the differences between the teams are really that big that it makes sense, then sure, you can do it. But honestly, I don't really still see the benefit, because you can have one catalog and you can, for example, differentiate the access just based on the permission. So you can define like different business units, and different business units will be able to see only the data relevant for their units. But usually it happens that over time, there is going to be some authority, some team in the company that should be able to access all of it. And you don't want this team to access 6 catalogs. Why should they? So what I would suggest is to really have one catalog. If there is a strong use case where you want to restrict access to the data for people from different business units, you can do that just by setting up the permissions. You don't need like multiple instances of the catalog for that. And if the reason for this would be about, for example, networking restrictions, that you cannot really see the data from one place, all the available systems from one place, this is not an issue as well, because nowadays most of the deployments are hybrid. So you can still have one centralized place where you gather all the metadata, and then you have like specific engines living in like dedicated environments. They ingest all the metadata, they generate it, they process the data, and they provide it to the centralized component. So I would suggest to go with one. Yes, I actually saw an example where it makes sense to have multiple ones, but it was like, let's say, an exception edge case. Maybe I would like to give you the next question. I think this is a good one about budgeting. So how do companies define their budget for investing in data governance? What's your take on this?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. That's also one that we see has changed considerably, say, with that expanded scope of data governance. So if you just look at the, say, traditional technical scope of data governance, it's pretty hard to put concrete dollar values to that. You could talk about, say, avoiding business disruption, avoiding smooth running of processes if you have master data management, and if you have in place, if you have a high data quality in place. But what we've seen now, because when we're linking data as a key driver, as a key component to generate business insights, we see that that discussion being leveled up, because all of a sudden by making that connection, you can start to tie effective business outcomes that might be an improvement in sales, that might be very narrowly say a marketing campaign that gives you a higher return than it does before. So by starting to tie these business use cases, by bringing in business audiences into the scope of data governance as the user audience, you can start to tie values to that in terms of how essentially having governance in place, having those capabilities in place, has actually enabled different business units to do their business better or do it at a lower cost. If you talk about business, is usually about the increased top line. So there's another way now that can start you to probably not have a mathematical formula for that, but start to evaluate the concrete value of the governance capabilities that you have in place by how it's being used, how it allows the business to use the data that is under that governance. There's another example when we talked about accountability and risk, and that's in particular goes into misuse of data. That can be data breaches, that can be, I say, unethical use of data in business decision, particularly when AI comes into place. That gives you another aspect, which is again not directly quantifiable, but there's a risk aspect in place if data gets misused that can have impact on your brand perception, for example, in the market. It can have regulatory impacts if you get fined for unethical use of data or for breaching data privacy or data protection laws. So all of that is essentially giving you more and more ammunition to make that budget decision, to make that business case for data governance. It goes well beyond, say, the technical focus. It has aspects of brand protection, it has aspects of customer trust, and it has a very different and a very direct connection to the business value that you can create. And you will only get that if you actually allow that data governance, as I said, as those capabilities that we talked earlier, democratization, data literacy, driving collaboration. That allows you to distill a business value to data governance that allows you to better define the budget. It's an iterative process, right? It's not that you can have all of these in place first, but this is how we can make a case of where is the value that data governance actually drives.
I would maybe add one thing to this to encourage the people to always measure the progress. So at the beginning, you always have some specific use case you want to accomplish. There's definitely some metric you should be tracking. So define the metric, make sure you actually measure the return on the investment. So like, I don't have like specific example per se, this differs company by company. Like we had, for example, customers using Ataccama for validating addresses because it was a company that was shipping products. And for them, it was actually really easy to calculate the loss of revenue because they were being penalized by companies like FedEx and so on for actually shipping packages to non-existing addresses. So this was like super easy to calculate because they paid, I don't know like how many dollars per invalid address. But I can imagine that like any company, if you give it a few minutes to think about it, it might not be exact, but it will give you a really good idea. Like, is it in the range of hundreds of thousands? Is it like millions? You can, like, you're experts at what you do. So I think you can make some educated guess that will help you justify the cost for the project. So we still have quite a lot of questions there, but we are running out of time. So I suggest what we will do instead is to answer the remaining questions offline. As we will be sending the follow-ups with slides and recordings, we can also send answers to the questions we were not able to get to.
That's right. All right. Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate the discussion. Hopefully there was a lot of consideration and value that was driven out of that for those who joined. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And again, as David mentioned, we will be sharing the material with everyone to be able to review for themselves. And any additional questions, just feel free to reach out to either us or Achim personally for any responses that you're looking for with that.